Okay, welcome back to part 2 on our discussion of market failures. We discussed a couple examples of externalities and defined externalities in the first lesson. So now let's look at why this leads to inefficiencies. To do this, we begin with a couple of definitions. The first is marginal private cost. It's the cost of an activity for the person or persons carrying out the activity, right? Marginal, additional, right? The marginal cost is the cost the firm would incur by producing one more unit. When we say marginal private cost, this is kind of what we traditionally think of as the marginal cost, right? It's all the cost the firm incurs. The social cost covers all the costs the firm incurs plus any extra costs that are borne by others. So any incidental costs that are also borne, that other members of society who aren't party to the transaction also incur. So a firm, when they're figuring out what the best thing for them to do is going, they will only consider their private costs, right? They'll only, the firm's looking at figuring out what output maximizes profits. They're going to look at the revenue that they bring in, the costs that they incur, and from that make a decision to maximize profits based on their private costs, but that is inefficient if there's an externality. So an efficient allocation accounts for the social costs, or if it's a positive externality, the fact that there's social benefits from this. So, as we're going to see graphically in a moment, when an activity has a negative externality, so like pollution or loud music in the evening, right? There's a side effect that the people not involved in the transaction are paying a cost for. When that happens, too much output will be produced. But kind of a corollary to this point, it does not imply none of the product is produced. Now, there could be cases where none of it's produced, but in the case of pollution, it doesn't mean that we don't have any pollution, but what the presence of the externality means we likely have more than we should have to be socially optimal. So too much of the output will be produced, but it doesn't mean that none of the product should be produced to be the efficient output. Those are both pretty key points in understanding the idea of market failures and what to do about these things. Related to that, if there's a positive externality, production will be lower than the socially optimal production. So think to vaccines, right? The US government subsidizes vaccine production, especially for flu vaccine. Why? Because there's benefits to more than just the user and the firm that's selling it. Right? Remember, we've discussed if half of society gets the flu shot, that's a huge chunk of people who can't spread the flu further. So even those who don't get the flu shot benefit because some people do indeed get the flu shot, and the total outbreak of the flu is a lot smaller because even among those who decide not to get the flu shot, the percentage they get it has dropped. So that's a positive externality. The production will be lower than socially optimal production unless there's something to fix it, right? In a pure market setting, but there would be too little produced. So externalities are indeed everywhere. Some other examples: firms that hire, on-the-job training, useful but unpatentable products. We talked about pollution. Abandoned buildings, right? That's run down, horrible to look at. Sometimes they can even be a place where criminals will gather. So there's a cost more than to just the person who has the abandoned building. Market economies, pure market economy alone can't fix these issues. The one thing to note, though, is especially on issues of pollution, many non-market economies have fared a lot worse. So just because you're in a non-market economy does not mean you do better at this. But in a pure market economy, you will have inefficiencies because of externalities. So what do economists recommend with this? Economists do not advocate a mandate of some specific standard on like a level of pollution. it's not efficient to say to a particular firm, you may not use this method, or you may not produce, or you have to cut down the pollution by so much. It's much more efficient to say, we've got to get to a certain level of pollution within society. And in order to do that, we're going to provide incentives or penalties. If you think back, first, right, this is often a really tough thing to grasp at first. But let's just think, before we go through any of the graphs on this stuff, which is coming up in just a moment, just think intuitively to say that society has producing 1 million units of some bad pollutant. What's the, what would be a bad pollutant? We could say it's carbon, right? I'm sure, we're going to say 1 million units just to be simple. I have no idea what the actual amount is. I'm sure it's much higher, but it depends how you define the units, of course. But we'll say it's 1 million units, and we'll say it's carbon, and society thinks this is bad. So one way you could go about this is you could go to each firm that's producing a high amount of carbon and say, you are not doing things well. You must cut down the amount of carbon. That is a way to do it, but it's a pretty lousy way to do it. It's a very inefficient for society. The reason is some of those firms, it could be extremely difficult based on the way they're set up to cut down on pollution. Others, it could be really, really easy for them to do it. And if you just set a blanket amount that everybody has to do, some are going to have to incur an enormous amount of costs to do this, while others could have done a whole lot more at basically no cost. If instead you designed, you know what, we're going to put in a tax on pollution, or we're going to provide a subsidy for each unit you cut down. Really, both of those should do the same thing. We're going to give you a tax credit, if you cut down on pollution, or we're going to tax you if you pollute. It is far better than the mandates, because you could actually set up the tax that you get to the same level, right? Your goal is 1 million units. You're at 1 million units. You want to get to 800,000 units. So you need to cut 200,000. The right size tax can get there very easily without mandating that any firm meets it. The benefit of that is the firms that can cut it very easily can cut it easily, and they'll save a lot on the tax money, or they'll get a bigger subsidy. The firms that can't cut down easily, they know they'll just have to pay the tax instead of cutting down. You still, as a whole, are polluting. You're cutting down your pollution by the same amount. It's just different firms are cutting at different amounts. Why do you, as a member of society, I don't care who's polluting as much as how much is in the air, right? If you want to cut it down by 200,000, who cares how you get there from your point of view? It shouldn't matter whether firm A is cutting it all the way to, cutting from 100 units to 0, and firm B is not cutting at all, or they're each cutting 50 units. The net result, both firms have, in total, you've cut out 100 units of pollution. So the problem with the mandate is you'll be stuck with firms that are inefficient, and products end up then costing more, and standard of living will not increase at the same level. And this is, once again, holding the same level of pollution. So you could actually, if you set up a tax or a subsidy right, let me move back one. If you set up the tax or the subsidy right, you could actually cut pollution more and cost society less than by providing a mandate, which, this is the essence of efficiency, right? You can get a bigger cut for a lower cost, which is, I think everybody's happy on that one. So government can help correct this when I've mentioned the idea. Subsidies or taxes, right? Polluters could pay for pollution. Conversely, you could subsidize firms that cut down on pollution, or subsidies for beneficial activities. You see it for vaccines, you see it for education, right, where there are good side effects. You end up seeing subsidies, and there's a good logical reason to see subsidies in these cases.